Preface and Introduction to What I Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Believe by Count Leo Tolstoy. Translated from the Russian by Konstantin Popov. Read by David Barnes. Preface. The name of Count Leo Tolstoy stands high in the annals of his country's literature as the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. His memory will be cherished, and his works will be read by later generations long after the author is no more. But none will remember him with such devoted affection as will the privileged few who have watched his life and labours during the last 7 years. During this period he has withdrawn from the world and its vanities, and has devoted himself to the study of the teachings of Christ. Having become profoundly impressed with the Saviour's words concerning the duty of living a life of unselfish toil for the benefit of others, he has been endeavouring in a practical way to carry out his Master's commands, and has devoted himself to ministering to his fellows. In these pages he sets forth the principles by which he is now ordering his life, and which he exhorts all men to adopt. The work has unfortunately been forbidden in Russia, but the manuscripts pass from hand to hand during their silent work of regeneration in the hearts of those who long for the coming of the kingdom of God on earth. To English readers the construction of the work may appear somewhat strange, and occasional statements may even seem startling, but though they may not be expressed in the conventional language to which the nations of England and America are accustomed, the right principles are inculcated, and it is the translator's earnest hope that Count Tolstoy's words may find an echo in the hearts of all those who believe in the regeneration of humanity through the spirit and teachings of Christ. C. Popov. Introduction. I am 55 years old, and with the exception of the 14 or 15 years of my childhood, I have been until recently a nihilist, in the proper signification of that term. I have not been a socialist or revolutionist, but a nihilist in the sense of being completely without faith. 5 years ago, I began to believe in the doctrine of Christ, and in consequence a great change has been wrought in me. I now no longer care for the things that I had prized, and I have begun to desire things concerning which I had formerly been indifferent. Like a man who, going out on business, on his way suddenly becomes convinced of the futility of that business, and turns back, and all that stood to the right now stands to the left, and all that was to the left is now to the right, his wish to be as far from home as possible is changed to the desire of being as near home as possible. So, I may say, the whole aim and purpose of my life has been changed. My desires are no more what they have been. For me, good and evil have changed places. The experience came through my apprehending the doctrine of Christ in an altogether different way, and seeing it in quite a new light. It is not my intention to interpret the doctrine of Christ, but simply to relate how I came to understand the simplest, clearest, and most intelligible point in that doctrine, and how, when once I had clearly grasped his meaning, it gave a new direction to all my thoughts. I have no wish to interpret the doctrine of Christ, but I should like to prevent others from interpreting it wrongly. Christian churches generally acknowledge that all men, however they may differ from each other in knowledge or mental capacity, are equal before God, and that the truth revealed to man is accessible to all. Christ himself has told us that the Father has hidden some things from the wise and prudent, and revealed them to babes. All men cannot be initiated into the mysteries of dogmatic, homiletic, or patristic theologies, and so on, but all can understand what Christ taught, and still teaches to simple and ignorant men. The teachings of Christ were incomprehensible to me until recently, but I understand them now, and what I have found I desire to explain to others. The thief on the cross believed in Christ and was saved. Would it have harmed anybody if the thief had not died on the cross, but had come down to tell us how he believed in Christ? Like the thief on the cross, I too believed in the doctrine of Christ and found my salvation in it. This is not a far-fetched comparison. It worthily describes the condition of anguish and despair I was once in, at the thought of life and of death, and it also indicates the peace and happiness that now fill my soul. Like the thief, I knew that my life was full of wickedness. I saw that the greater part of those around me were morally no better than I was. Like the thief too, I knew that I was unhappy and that I suffered, and that all around me were unhappy and suffering likewise, and I saw no way out of this state of misery but through death. Like the thief, I was nailed, as it were by some invisible power, to this life of suffering and evil, and the same dreadful darkness of death that awaited the thief after his useless suffering and enduring of the evils of life awaited me. In all this I was like the thief, but there was this difference between us. He was dying, and I still lived. The thief could believe that his salvation would be realized beyond the grave, but I could not, because, putting aside the life beyond the grave, I had yet to live on earth. I did not, however, understand life. It seemed awful to me, until I heard the words of Christ and understood them, and then life and death no longer seemed to be evils. Instead of despair, I felt the joy of possessing a life that death has no power to destroy. Can it harm anyone if I relate now how it was that this change was effected in me? End of introduction. Chapter 1 of What I Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Believe by Count Leo Tolstoy. Translated from the Russian by Konstantin Popov. Read by David Barnes. Chapter 1. I have endeavoured to explain the reason why I had not properly understood the doctrine of Christ in my two works, a criticism on dogmatic theology, and a new translation and comparison of the four Gospels with a commentary. In these works I examine all that conceals the truth from the eyes of men, and also retranslate and compare the four Gospels verse by verse. I have been engaged for some 6 years upon this work. Every year, every month, I find new solutions and suggestions, and I am enabled to correct the defects that creep in through haste or impulse. My life will perhaps end before the work is complete, but I am sure that it is a much-needed labour I have imposed on myself, and therefore I shall do what I can while my life lasts. This is my outward work on the theology of the Gospel, but the inner working of my soul, which I wish to speak of here, was not the result of a methodical investigation of doctrinal theology, or of the actual texts of the Gospel. It was a sudden removal of all that hid the true meaning of the Christian doctrine, a momentary flash of light which made everything clear to me. It was something like that which might happen to a man who, after vainly attempting by a false plan to build up a statue out of a confused heap of small pieces of marble, suddenly guesses at the figure they are intended to form by the shape of the largest piece, and then, on beginning to set up the statue, finds his guess confirmed by the harmonious joining in of the various pieces. I wish to tell in this work how I found the key to the doctrine of Christ, by the help of which the truth was disclosed to me so clearly and convincingly. I made the discovery in the following manner. Almost from the first years of my childhood, when I began to read the Gospel for myself, The doctrine that teaches love, humility, meekness, self-denial, and returning good for evil was the doctrine that touched me most. I always considered it as the basic teaching of Christianity, and loved it as such. But it was only after a long period of unbelief that its full meaning flashed upon me, that I understood life as our unlettered working classes understand it, and accepted the same creed that they profess, the creed of the Greek Orthodox Church. But I soon observed that I should not find in the teaching of the Church the confirmation of my idea that love, humility, meekness, and self-denial were the essential principles of Christianity. I saw that this, which I regarded as the basis of Christianity, did not form the main point in the public teaching of the Church. At first I did not attach much importance to this. The Church, I said to myself, acknowledges, beside the doctrine of love, humility, and self-denial, a dogmatic and ritualistic doctrine. This estranges my heart. It is even repulsive to me, but there is no harm in it. While, however, submitting to the teaching of the Church, I began to see more and more clearly that this peculiarity was not as unimportant as I had at first regarded it. I was drawn away from the Church by various singularities in its dogmas, by its approval of persecution, capital punishment, and war, and also by its intolerance of all other forms of worship than its own. But my faith in the teaching of the Church was shaken still more by its indifference to what seemed to me the very basis of the teaching of Christ, and by its evident partiality for what I could not consider an essential part of that doctrine. I felt that there was something wrong, but I could not make out distinctly what it was, because the Church did not deny what seemed to me the main point in the doctrine of Christ, though it failed to give it its proper position and influence. I only passed from nihilism to the Church because I felt the impossibility of living without faith, without a knowledge of what is good and evil, resting on something more than my animal instincts. I hoped to find this something in Christianity, but Christianity, as it appeared to me then, was only a certain disposition of mind, and a very vague one. I turned to the Church for obligatory precepts of life, but the Church gave me only such as did not draw me nearer to the Christian state of mind I longed for, but rather alienated me from it. I turned away from the Church. For the precepts that were given to me by the Church concerning belief in dogmas, observance of the sacraments, fast days, and prayers I did not care, and precepts really founded on the teachings of Christ were wanting. Moreover, the precepts of the Church weakened and sometimes even destroyed that Christian state of mind that alone seemed to me to be the true aim of life. What perplexed me most of all was that all the evil things that men do, such as condemning private individuals, whole nations, or other religions, and the inevitable results of these condemnations, executions and wars, were justified by the Church. I saw that the doctrine of Christ, which teaches us humility, tolerance, forgiveness, self-denial, and love, was extolled by the Church, but at the same time she sanctioned what was incompatible with such teachings. Could the doctrine of Christ be so weak and inconsistent? That I could not believe. Besides, it had always perplexed me to find that the texts upon which the Church has grounded her dogmas are of an obscure character, whereas those that teach us how to live are the most simple and clear. While the Church specifies the dogmas and the duties derived from them in the most forcible manner, the practice of the doctrine is urged only in obscure, dim, and mystical expressions. Is it possible that this was what Christ desired for his teaching? I could only find the solution of my doubts in the perusal of the Gospels, and I read them over and over again. Of all the Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount was the portion that impressed me most, and I studied it more often than any other part. Nowhere else does Christ speak with such solemnity. Nowhere else does he give us so many clear and intelligible moral precepts which commend themselves to everyone. If there are any clear and definite precepts of Christianity, they must have been expressed in this sermon, and therefore, in those 3 chapters of St. Matthew's Gospel, I sought the solution of my doubts. Many and many a time I read over the sermon, and every time I felt the same emotion on reading the texts about turning my cheek to the one who strikes me, giving up my cloak to him who takes my coat, being at peace with all men, and loving my enemies. And yet there remained in me the same feeling of dissatisfaction. The words of God were not as yet clear to me. They seemed to enjoin an impossible self-denial that annulled life itself, and therefore it seemed to me that such self-denial could not be the requirement on which man's salvation depended. But then, if that were not the express condition of salvation, there was nothing fixed and clear. I not only read the Sermon on the Mount, but the rest of the Gospels and various commentaries on them. Our theological explanations tell us that in the teachings of the Sermon of the Mount, an indication is given of the perfection after which man must strive, that man, being full of sin, cannot attain this perfection by his own unaided strength, and that the salvation of man lies in faith, prayer, and the gifts of the grace of God. But these explanations did not satisfy me. Why should Christ have given to us such clear and good precepts, applicable to us all, if he knew beforehand that the keeping of them was impossible by man in his own unaided strength? On reading over these precepts, it always seemed that they applied to me, and that I was morally bound to obey them. I even felt convinced that I could, immediately and from that very hour, do all that they enjoined. I wished and tried to do so, but as soon as any difficulty arose in the way of my keeping them, I involuntarily remembered the teaching of the Church, that man is weak and can do no good thing by himself, and then I became weak. I had been told that it was necessary to believe and to pray, but I felt that my faith was weak and that I could not pray. I had been told that it was necessary to pray for faith, for that faith without which prayer is of no avail. I was told that faith comes through prayer, and that prayer comes through faith, which, to say the least, was certainly bewildering. Such statements commended themselves neither to reason nor experience. After much useless study of the works that have been written in proof of the divinity or non-divinity of this doctrine, and after many doubts and much suffering, I was left alone with the mysterious book in which the doctrine of Christ is taught. I could not interpret it as others did. I could not abjure the book, and yet I could not find a new and satisfying interpretation. It was only after losing all faith in the explanations of learned theology and criticism, and after laying them all aside in obedience to the words of Christ, Mark 10:15, that I began to understand what had until then seemed incomprehensible to me. It was not by deep thought or by skillfully comparing or commenting on the texts of the Gospel that I came to understand the doctrine. On the contrary, all grew clear to me for the very reason that I had ceased to rest on mere interpretations. The text that gave me the key to the truth was the 39th verse of the 5th chapter of St. Matthew. You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist evil. The simple meaning of these words suddenly flashed full upon me. I accepted the fact that Christ meant exactly what he said, and then, though I had found nothing new, all that had hitherto obscured the truth cleared away, and the truth itself arose before me in all its solemn importance. I had often read the passage, but these words had never until now arrested my attention. I say to you, do not resist evil. In my conversations since with many Christian people who know the Gospels well, I have observed the same indifference to the force of this text that I had felt. Nobody specially remembered the words, and while conversing with persons upon the text, I have known them to take up the New Testament in order to assure themselves that the words were really there. The words, "Whoever shall strike you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also," had always presented themselves to me as requiring endurance and self-mastery, such as human nature is hardly capable of. They touched me. I felt that to act thus would be to attain moral perfection, but I felt, too, that I should never be able to obey them if they entailed nothing but suffering. I said to myself, well, I will turn my cheek, I will let myself be struck again, I will give up my coat, they shall take my all, they shall even take away my life. Yet life is given to me. Why should I thus lose it? This cannot be what Christ requires of us. Then I said to myself, perhaps in these words Christ only purposes to extol suffering and self-denial, and in doing so he speaks exaggeratingly, and his expressions are therefore to be regarded as illustrations rather than precise requirements. But as soon as I comprehended the meaning of the words, "Do not resist evil," it became clear to me that Christ does not exaggerate, that he does not require suffering for the mere sake of suffering, and that he only expresses clearly and definitely what he means. He says, "Do not resist evil," and if you do not resist evil, you may meet with some who, having struck you on one cheek, and meeting with no resistance, will strike you on the other. After having taken away your coat, will take away your cloak also. Having profited by your work, will oblige you to work on, will take and will never give back. Nevertheless, I say to you, do not resist evil. Still do good to those who even strike and abuse you. Now I understood that the whole force of the teaching lay in the words, "Do not resist evil," and that the entire context was but an application of that great precept. I saw that Christ does not require us to turn the other cheek and to give away our cloak in order to make us suffer, but he teaches us not to resist evil and warns us that doing so may involve personal suffering. Does a father, on seeing his son set out on a long journey, tell him to pass sleepless nights, to eat little, to get wet through, or to freeze? Will he not rather say to him, "Go, and if on the road you are cold or hungry, do not be discouraged, but go on"? Christ does not say, "Let a man strike your cheek and suffer," but he says, "Do not resist evil. Whatever men may do to you, do not resist evil." These words, "Do not resist evil," or the wicked man, thus apprehended, were the clue that made all clear to me, and I was surprised that I could have hitherto treated them in such a different way. Christ meant to say, whatever men may do to you, bear, suffer, and submit, but never resist evil. What could be clearer, more intelligible, and more indubitable than this? As soon as I understood the exact meaning of these simple words, all that had appeared confused to me in the doctrine of Christ grew intelligible. What had seemed contradictory now became consistent, and what I had deemed superfluous became indispensable. All united in one whole, one part fitting into and supporting the other, like the pieces of a broken statue, put together again in their proper places. This doctrine of non-resistance is commended again and again in the Gospels. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ represents his followers, i.e. those who follow this law of non-resistance, as liable to be persecuted, stoned, and reduced to beggary. Elsewhere he tells us that the disciple who does not take up his cross, who is not willing to renounce all, cannot be his follower, and he thus describes the man who is ready to bear the consequences that may result from the practice of the doctrine of non-resistance. Christ says to his disciples, "Be poor, be ready to bear persecution, suffering, and even death, without resisting evil." He prepared for suffering and death himself, without resisting evil. He reproved Peter, who grieved over him because he proposed to yield in this way, and he died, forbidding others to resist evil, remaining true to his own doctrine and his own example. All his first disciples obeyed the same law of the non-resistance of evil, and passed their lives in disability and persecution. We may bring forward as an objection the difficulty of always obeying such a law. We may even say, as unbelievers do, that it is a foolish doctrine, that Christ was a dreamer, an idealist who gave precepts that are impossible to follow. But whatever our objections may be, we cannot deny that Christ expresses his meaning most clearly and distinctly, and his meaning is that man must not resist evil. He who fully accepts his teaching cannot resist evil. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of What I Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Believe by Count Leo Tolstoy, translated from the Russian by Konstantin Popov, read by David Barnes. Chapter 2. When I at last clearly comprehended that the words "do not resist evil" do really mean that we are never to resist evil, my former ideas concerning the teaching of Christ underwent a complete change. I wondered, not so much at my eyes being opened to the truth at last, but at the strange darkness that had until then enveloped my understanding. I knew, we all know, that the foundation requirement of the Christian doctrine is love toward all men. Isn't all Christianity summed up in the words, "Love your enemies"? I had known that from my earliest childhood. How was it, then, that I had not hitherto taken in these words in all their simplicity, but rather had sought for some allegorical meaning in them? "Do not resist evil" means never to resist evil, that is, never offer violence to anyone. If a man reviles you, do not revile him in return. Suffer, but do no violence. While believing, or at least endeavouring to believe, that he who gave us this commandment was God, how did I come to say that I could not obey it in my own strength? If my master were to say to me, "Go and cut wood," and I were to answer that I could not do it in my own strength, would it not show that either I had no faith in my master's words, or that I did not choose to obey him? God has given to us a commandment that he requires us to obey. He says that only those who keep his commandments shall enter life eternal. He fulfilled his commandment himself, as offering us his example. And how could I then say that, though I never really tried to fulfill it, this injunction was one that it was impossible for a man to keep in his own strength, and without supernatural aid? God became man for the securing of our salvation. Salvation lies in the fact that the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, suffered for us men, redeemed us from sin, and gave us the Church, through which the grace of God is transmitted to all believers. Moreover, God the Son has left us this doctrine, or teaching, and his own example, to show us the way of salvation. And yet, I said that the rule of life given to us by Christ was not only a hard one, but also an impossible one, apart from supernatural aid. Christ does not consider it as such. On the contrary, he says definitely that we are to fulfill his commandments, and that he who does not shall not enter the kingdom of God. He does not say that it is hard to keep this law. He says, on the contrary, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." St. John the Evangelist says, "His commandments are not grievous." How was it, I said, that the express and positive commandment of God, which he himself speaks of as being easy, the commandment which he himself obeyed as a man, and which his first followers also fulfilled, was too hard for me, and even impossible for me, without supernatural aid? If a man were to set all the faculties of his mind to the annulling of a given law, what more forcible argument could he use for its suppression than that it was an impracticable law, and that the legislator's own opinion of it was that it could not be kept without supernatural aid? And yet this was exactly what I had thought about the commandment not to resist evil. I tried to remember when and how the strange idea had first come into my mind, that the doctrine of Christ was divine in authority but impossible in practice. On reviewing my past life, I discovered that this idea had never been transmitted to me in all its nakedness, for then it would have repelled me, but that I had imperceptibly imbibed it from my earliest childhood, and that the associations of my life had confirmed the strange error. I was taught from my childhood that Christ is God, and that his teaching is divine and authoritative, while, on the other hand, I was also told to respect those institutions that, by means of violence, secured my safety from evil. I was taught to honour those institutions as being sacred. I was taught to resist evil, and it was instilled into me that it was humiliating and dishonourable to submit to evil and to suffer from it, and that it was praiseworthy to resist evil. I was taught to condemn and to execute. I was taught to make war, that is, to resist evil by murder. The army, a member of which I was called a Christ-loving army, and the Church consecrated its mission. I was taught to resist an offender by violence, and to avenge a private insult, or one against my native land, by violence. All this was never regarded as wrong, but, on the contrary, I was told that it was perfectly right, and in no way contrary to Christ's doctrine. All surrounding interests, such as the peace and safety of my family, my property and myself, were based on the law that was rejected by Christ, on the law of a tooth for a tooth. Ecclesiastical teachers told me that the doctrine of Christ was divine, but that its observance was impossible on account of the weakness of human nature, and that the grace of God alone could enable us to keep this law. Secular teachers told me, and the whole order of life proved, that the teaching of Christ was impracticable and ideal, and that we must in fact live contrary to his doctrine. I imbibed such a notion of the practical impossibility of following the divine doctrine, gradually and almost imperceptibly. I was so accustomed to it, it coincided so well with all my animal feelings, that I had never observed the contradiction in which I lived. I did not see that it was impossible to admit the Godhead of Christ, the basis of whose teaching is non-resistance of evil, and at the same time to work consciously and calmly for the institutions of property, courts of law, kingdoms, the army, and so on. It could not be consistent for us to regulate our lives contrary to the doctrine of Christ, and then pray to the same Christ that we might be enabled to keep his commandments, to forgive, and not to resist evil. It did not then occur to me, as it does now, that it would be much simpler to regulate our lives according to the doctrine of Christ, and then, if courts of law, executions, and war were found to be indispensably necessary for our welfare, we might pray to have them too. And I understood from where my error arose. It arose from my professing Christ in words, and denying him indeed. The precept not to resist evil is one that contains the whole substance of Christ's doctrine, if we consider it not only as a saying, but also as a law we are bound to obey. It is like a latchkey that will open any door, but only if it is well inserted into the lock. To consider this rule of life as a precept that cannot be obeyed without supernatural aid is to annihilate the whole doctrine of Christ completely. How can a doctrine, the fundamental law of which is cast aside as impracticable, be considered practicable in any of its details? This is what was done with Christ's doctrine when we were taught that it was possible to be a Christian without fulfilling his law not to resist evil. A few days ago I was reading the 5th chapter of St. Matthew to a Hebrew rabbi. "That is in the Bible. That is in the Talmud too," he said at almost each saying, pointing out to me in the Bible and the Talmud passages very much like those in the Sermon on the Mount. But when I came to the verse that says, "Do not resist evil," he did not say, "That is also in the Talmud," but only asked me with a smile, "Do Christians keep this law? Do they turn the other cheek to be struck?" I was silent. What answer could I give, when I knew that Christians in our days, far from turning the other cheek when struck, never let an opportunity escape of striking a Hebrew on both cheeks? I was greatly interested to know if there was any law like this in the Talmud, and I inquired. He answered, "No, there is nothing like it. But pray tell me, do Christians ever keep this law?" His question showed me clearly that the existence of a precept in the law of Christ, which is not only left unobserved, but of which the fulfilment is considered impossible, is superfluous and irrational. Now that I comprehend the true meaning of the doctrine, I see clearly the strange state of contradiction within my own self that I had permitted to arise. I was confessing Christ as God and his teaching as divine, and at the same time I was ordering my life contrary to his teaching. What was left for me to do but to acknowledge the teaching as an impracticable one? In word, I acknowledged the teaching of Christ as sacred, but I did not carry out that teaching in deed, for I admitted and respected the unchristian institutions that surrounded me. Throughout the Old Testament we find it said that the misfortunes of the Israelites arose from their believing in false gods and not in the true God. In the 8th and 12th chapters of the first book of Samuel, the prophet accuses the people of having chosen, instead of God, who was their king, a human king who, according to their opinion, was to save them. "Do not believe in toga, vain things," says Samuel to the people. 1 Samuel 12:21. "They will not help you and will not save you, for they are toga, vain. In order not to perish with your king, believe in God alone." My faith in these toga, in these empty idols, hid the truth from my eyes. In my way to him, these toga, which I did not have the strength to renounce, stood before me, obscuring his light. One day, as I was passing through Borovitsky Gate, I saw a crippled old beggar with his head bound up in a ragged cloth and sitting in a corner. I had just taken out my purse to bestow a trifle upon him, when a bold, ruddy-faced young grenadier in a government fur coat came running down the Kremlin slope. On seeing the soldier, the beggar sprang up with a look of terror and ran limping down toward the Alexander Garden. The grenadier pursued him, but, not succeeding in overtaking him, stopped short and began to abuse the poor fellow for having dared to sit down near the entrance gate in defiance of orders. I waited until the grenadier came up to where I stood, and then I asked if he could read. "Yes, what of that?" was the answer. "Have you ever read the Gospel?" "I have." "Do you know these words, 'He who feeds the hungry'?" I repeated the text to him. He listened attentively. 2 passers-by stopped. It was evidently disagreeable to the grenadier that, while conscientiously discharging his duty by driving people away from the entrance gate, as he was ordered to do, he unexpectedly found himself in the wrong. He looked puzzled, and seemed to be searching for some excuse. Suddenly his dark eyes brightened up with a look of intelligence, and moving away as if about to return to his post, he asked, "Have you read the military code?" I told him that I had not. "Well then, do not talk of what you do not understand," he said, with a triumphant shake of his head. And muffling himself up in his overcoat, he went back to his post. He was the only man I have met in all my life who strictly, logically, solved the problem of our social institutions, which had stood before me and still stands before each who calls himself a Christian. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of What I Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Believe by Count Leo Tolstoy, translated from the Russian by Konstantin Popov, read by David Barnes. Chapter 3. To affirm that the Christian doctrine refers only to personal salvation and has no bearing upon state affairs is a great error. To say so is but to assert an audacious, groundless, most evident untruth, which a moment's serious reflection suffices to destroy. Well, I say to myself, I will not resist evil. As a private man, I will let myself be struck. But what am I to do if an enemy invades my native land, or other nations oppress it? I am called upon to take part in a struggle against evil, to go and kill. The question immediately arises, which will be serving God, and which will be serving toga? To go or not to go? Suppose I am a peasant. I am chosen as the senior member of my village, as judge, as juryman. I am bound to take an oath, to judge and to punish. Fellow creature, what am I to do? I have again to choose between the law of God and the law of man. Or let us say I am a monk and live in a monastery. The neighbouring peasants have taken possession of the hay we had mown for our own use. I am sent to take part in a struggle against evil, to prosecute these men. I have again to choose between the laws of God and the laws of man. None of us can evade the demand for such a decision. To say nothing of the class of society that I belong to, military men, judges, administrators, whose whole lives are passed in resisting evil, there is not a single private individual, be he ever so insignificant, who has not had to choose between serving God by fulfilling His commandments, or serving the toga in the government institutions of his country. Our private lives are interwoven with the organization of the state, and the latter requires unchristian duties of us, contrary to the commandments of Christ. At the present time, the military service, which is obligatory on all, and the participation of each as jurymen in the courts of law, place this dilemma with striking clarity before all. Each man is called upon to take up an instrument of murder, a gun, a sword. Even if he does not kill a fellow creature, he loads the gun and sharpens the sword, that is, he is ready to commit murder. Each citizen is called upon to enter the courts of law, to take part in judging and punishing his fellow creature. That is, each must renounce the doctrine of Christ that teaches us not to resist evil. The grenadier's question, the gospel or the military code, the law of God or the law of man, it still stands before us all, as it did in the time of Samuel. It stood before Christ and his disciples. It now stands before all those who wish to be Christians. It stood before me. The doctrine of Christ, which teaches love, humility, and self-denial, had always attracted me, but I found a contrary law, both in the history of the past and in the present organization of our lives, a law repugnant to my heart, my conscience, and my reason, but one that flattered my animal instincts. I knew that if I accepted the doctrine of Christ, I should be forsaken, miserable, persecuted, and sorrowing, as Christ tells us his followers will be. I knew that if I accepted that law of man, I should have the approbation of my fellow men, I should be at peace and in safety. All possible sophisms would be at hand to quiet my conscience, and I should laugh and be merry, as Christ says. I felt this, and therefore I avoided a closer examination of the law of Christ, and tried to comprehend it in a way that should not prevent my still leading my animal life. But, finding that impossible, I desisted from all attempts at comprehension. This led me into a state of mental obscurity, which now seems surprising to me. For instance, let me recall my former interpretation of the words, "Do not judge, and you shall not be judged," Matthew 7:1. "Do not judge, and you shall not be judged. Do not condemn, and you shall not be condemned," Luke 6:37. The court of law, of which I was a member, and which guarded my property and my personal safety, seemed to me so unquestionably sacred that it never came into my mind that the words, "Do not condemn," could have any higher meaning than that we are not to speak evil of our fellow men. The idea never occurred to me that these words could have any reference to courts of law, district courts, criminal courts, assizes, courts of peace, etc. When I at last took in the real meaning of the words, "Do not resist evil," the question arose in my mind, what would Christ's opinion be of all these courts of law? And seeing clearly that he would reject them, I asked myself, do these words mean that we are not only never to speak evil of our brethren, but that we are not to condemn them to punishment by our human institutions of justice? In the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 6, verses 37 to 39, these words come immediately after the commandment not to resist evil, and to return good for evil. After the words, "Be merciful, even as your Father in heaven is merciful," we read, "Do not judge, and you shall not be judged. Do not condemn, and you shall not be condemned." Doesn't it mean that we are not only never to condemn our brother in word, that is, to speak evil of him, but that we are not to institute courts of law for the condemnation of a fellow creature to punishment? I said to myself, and no sooner did this question arise than both my heart and my reason answered in the affirmative. I know now how greatly this way of understanding the words surprises everyone at first. I was surprised too. To show how far I formerly was from the true interpretation of these words, I may here mention a foolish saying of mine, of which I am now heartily ashamed. Even after having become a believer, and having recognized the divinity of the gospel, I used to say jokingly, on meeting with a friend who was an attorney or a judge, "So you go on judging, and yet isn't it said, 'Do not judge, and you shall not be judged'?" I was so firmly convinced that these words had no other meaning than that we were not to speak ill of one another, that I did not see the blasphemy of my own words. So sure was I that the words were not to be taken in a literal sense, that I used them, jokingly, in their true application. I shall give a circumstantial account of the way in which all my doubts as to the real sense of these words were dispersed, and how it became evident to me that Christ forbids all human institutions of justice, and that he could mean nothing else. The first point that struck me when I understood the commandment, "Do not resist evil," in its true meaning, was that human courts were not only contrary to this commandment, but in direct opposition to the whole doctrine of Christ, and that therefore he must certainly have forbidden them. Christ says, "Do not resist evil." The sole object of courts of law is to resist evil. Christ enjoins us to return good for evil. Courts of law return evil for evil. Christ says, "Make no distinction between the just and the unjust." Courts of law do nothing else. Christ says, "Forgive all. Forgive not once, not 7 times, but forgive without end. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you." Courts of law do not forgive, but they punish. They do not do good, but evil to those whom they call the enemies of society. So, the true sense of the doctrine is that Christ forbids all courts of law. This cannot be the case, I said to myself. Christ had nothing to do with human courts of law, and never considered them. But I soon saw that this supposition was impossible. From the day of his birth, Christ had to submit to the jurisdiction of Herod, the Sanhedrin, and the high priests. Indeed, we find that Christ speaks more than once of tribunals as being an evil. He tells his disciples that they will have to be cited before the tribunals, and teaches them how they are to behave in courts of law. He says that he himself will be condemned, and sets us all an example of the way in which we are to treat the laws of man. There can be no doubt that Christ meant the human courts of law, which were to condemn him and his disciples, which have always condemned and still continue to condemn millions of men. Christ must have seen this evil, for he distinctly points it out. In the case of the adulteress, he positively rejects human justice, and proves that, on account of each man's own sinful nature, he has no right to judge another. We find the same doctrine repeated several times, as when he says, for instance, that the one who has a beam in his own eye cannot see the mote in his neighbour's eye, and that the blind cannot lead the blind. But perhaps, I said to myself, this applies only to the judgment of the adulteress, and the parable of the mote is only intended to show us the frailty of human nature in general. Christ does not intend to forbid our having recourse to human justice for our protection against evil men. But I saw that this would not hold true either. In the Sermon on the Mount, addressed to all men, Christ says, "And if anyone sues you at the law for your coat, let him have your cloak also." Therefore he forbids our going to law. But perhaps this applies only to the relations between private individuals and public courts of law. Perhaps Christ does not deny justice itself, and admits in Christian societies the existence of persons chosen for the purpose of administering justice. I see that this hypothesis is likewise inadmissible. In his prayer, Christ enjoins all men, without exception, to forgive as they hope to be forgiven. We find the same precept repeated many times. Each man must forgive his brother when he prays, and before bringing his gift. How then can a man judge and condemn another, when, according to the faith he professes, he is bound to forgive? Thus I see that, according to the doctrine of Christ, a judge who condemns his fellow creature to death is no Christian. But perhaps the connection between the words "do not judge, do not condemn," and those that follow, proves that they do not refer to human courts of law. This is likewise false. On the contrary, the connection between these words and those that follow proves clearly that the words "do not judge" are directed precisely against the institutions of courts of law. According to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the texts "do not judge, do not condemn" are preceded by the words "do not resist evil, suffer evil, do good to all." In the Gospel according to Matthew, the words of the Hebrew criminal law are repeated: "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." And after citing the criminal law, Christ says, "But you are not to act thus. Do not resist evil." Then he goes on to say, "Do not judge." So Christ's words refer precisely to our human criminal law, and by the words "do not judge," he clearly rejects it. Besides this, we find in St. Luke that he not only says "do not judge," but also adds, "and do not condemn." The latter word, almost synonymous with the former, must have been added with some purpose, and it could have been with no other than that of showing clearly the sense in which the first word is to be taken. Had he wished to say, "Do not judge your neighbour," that is, do not speak evil of him, he would have said so, but he says plainly, "Do not condemn," and then adds, "and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you shall be forgiven." But perhaps Christ's words do not apply to courts of law at all, and I give them an interpretation of my own that is foreign to them. I tried to discover how the first followers of Christ, his disciples, considered human courts of law, and whether they approved of them. In chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, the disciple James says, "Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of his brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another?" The word that is translated as "do not speak evil" is the word katalaleo. Even without consulting the dictionary, it is evident to all that this word can mean nothing but to accuse. This is the only true meaning of the word, as anyone can find by consulting the dictionary. The translation of the passage in question is as follows: "He who speaks evil of his brother speaks evil of the law." And the question involuntarily arises, how so? In speaking evil of my brother, I do not speak evil of the law of man. No, but if I accuse and sit in judgment over my brother, I evidently condemn the doctrine of Christ. That is, I look upon the doctrine of Christ as insufficient, and thus judge and condemn the law of God. It clearly follows that I do not fulfill this law, but I myself become a judge. A judge, Christ says, is he who can save. Then how can I, being unable to save, be a judge and punish? The whole text speaks of human judgment and rejects it. The whole of this epistle is penetrated with the same idea. In the same epistle of James, chapter 2, verses 1 to 13, he says, "My brethren, do not have the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, together with a respect of persons. For if there comes into your assembly a man with a gold ring in fine clothes, and there comes in also a poor man in shabby clothes, and you have respect for him who wears the fine clothing, and if you say to him, 'Sit here in a good place,' and say to the poor man, 'Stand there,' or 'Sit here under my footstool,' are you not then being partial, and have you not become judges with evil thoughts? Hearken, my beloved brethren, hasn't God chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have despised the poor. Don't rich men oppress you and draw you before the judgment seat? Don't they blaspheme that worthy name by which you are called? If you fulfill the royal law according to Scripture, you shall love your neighbour as yourself." Leviticus 19:18. You do well. But if you have respect to persons, you commit sin, and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law, and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not kill." Now if you commit no adultery, yet if you kill, you have become a transgressor of the law. Deuteronomy 22:22, Leviticus 28:17-25. So speak and act as those who shall be judged by the law of liberty. For he who has shown no mercy shall have judgment without mercy. Mercy triumphs over the law. The last words, mercy triumphs over the law, have often been translated as mercy is extolled in judgment, and are cited as meaning that the existence of human judgment may be admitted, provided that it is merciful. James exhorts his brethren to make no difference between men. If you make any difference, then you diakrinati, become partial, and are like judges with evil thoughts. You judge the beggar as being less worthy than the rich man. On the contrary, the rich man is the less worthy one. It is he who oppresses you and draws you before the judgment seat. If you live according to the law of love and mercy, which James calls the royal law, to distinguish it from the other, you do well. But if you have respect of persons, and make a distinction between rich and poor, you are transgressors of the law of mercy. James, bearing in mind the case of the adulteress who was brought before Christ to be stoned, or perhaps speaking of adultery in general, says that he who punishes an adulteress with death is guilty of murder, and transgresses the eternal law, because the same eternal law that forbids adultery also forbids murder. He says, and act like men who are judged by the law of liberty, because there is no mercy for him who is himself without mercy, and therefore mercy destroys judgment. Can anything be more clear and definite? Every distinction between men is forbidden, every judgment by which we consider the one as good and the other as bad. Human justice is distinctly pointed out as being evil. It is clearly shown that judgment sins by punishing for crime, and that all judgment is annihilated by the law of God, mercy. I read the epistle of Paul the Apostle, who had himself suffered from courts of law, and in his first chapter to the Romans he warns them against their vices and errors, and speaks against their courts of law, Romans 1:32, who, knowing the judgment of God, that they who commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in those who do them. Romans 2:1-4, therefore you are without excuse, you who judge. For when you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge do the same things. But we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against those who commit such things. And do you think that when you judge those who do such things, and do the same things yourself, that you shall escape the judgment of God? Or do you despise the riches of his goodness and forbearance and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? The Apostle Paul says, while fully aware of the last judgment of God, men act unjustly themselves, and they teach others to do the same. Therefore the man who judges another cannot be justified. Such is the opinion I find in the epistles of the apostles in reference to courts of law. We all know that, during the whole course of their lives, human courts of law could never have been considered by them as anything but evil, a trial that was to be endured with firmness and submission to the will of God. On reviewing the position of the early Christians amidst the heathens, we clearly perceive that men who were themselves persecuted by human courts of law could never have dared openly to forbid them. They could only occasionally allude to them as an evil, the basis of which they could not admit. I examine the writings of the earliest teachers of Christianity, and find that they all consider the precept never to use force, never to condemn or execute, as the one that distinguishes their doctrine from all others. Athenagoras, Origen. They only submit to the tortures inflicted upon them by human justice. The martyrs all confessed the same, not only in word, but also in deed. I find that all true Christians, from the disciples up to the time of Constantine, regarded courts of law as evils that had to be endured with patience, and the possibility of a Christian's taking any part in judging another never occurred to any one of them. All this convinced me that the words "do not judge and do not condemn" apply to courts of law, and yet these words are so generally understood as meaning only "speak no evil of your neighbour," that courts of law flourish so boldly and with such assurance in all Christian states, and are openly upheld by the Church. It was some time before I could feel quite convinced that my interpretation was the right one. If all have until now interpreted the words as referring to evil speaking, and have consequently instituted these courts of law, they must have some good grounds for acting thus, I said to myself, and I must be in the wrong. And I turned to the commentaries of the Church. In all of them, from the 5th century to the present day, I found that these words are considered as signifying to condemn in word, that is, to speak evil of our neighbour. Now, if these words are understood as meaning nothing else, doesn't the question immediately arise, how can we help judging others? We must condemn or blame what is evil. Thus, the point on which all comments turn is, what may we condemn, and what may we not condemn? We are told that these words cannot be considered as forbidding the servants of the Church to judge, that the apostles themselves judged, Chrysostom and Theophylactus. We are told that these words of Christ probably applied to the Hebrews, who often used to accuse their neighbours of trifling sins while committing greater ones themselves. But nowhere is there a word said about our human institutions of courts of law, or of the reference that this precept not to judge might have to them. Does Christ forbid them, or does he approve of them? This question, which arises so naturally in our minds, is left unanswered, as if there could not be the slightest doubt that, when once a Christian has taken his seat in the judgment hall, he has a right not only to judge his neighbour, but also even to condemn him to death. I consulted the Greek, Catholic, and Protestant theologians, as well as the works of the Tübingen school, and found that even the most liberal interpreters considered these words as meaning not to speak evil of. Not one of them solves the question why so narrow an interpretation is given, and why they are not considered as prohibiting the institutions of courts of law, or why Christ, while forbidding our speaking evil of a fellow creature, which each of us may often do inadvertently, does not consider as wrong, and does not forbid the same condemnation when given consciously and accompanied by violence against the condemned man. That the word condemn may apply to judiciary condemnation, from which millions suffer, is not even hinted at. Nor is this all. By means of these very words, do not judge and do not condemn, the form of judiciary condemnation is set altogether apart and fenced round. Our theological interpretations say that the existence of courts of law in Christian states is necessary, and is not contrary to the law of Christ. This made me doubt the sincerity of these interpretations, and I applied myself to a closer examination of the translation of the words judge and condemn, which is the thing I ought to have begun with. In the original, these words are krino and katadikadzo. The incorrect rendering of the word katalaleo in the Epistle of James, which is translated as do not speak evil, confirmed my doubts of the correctness of the translation. I consulted the translation of the words krino and katadikadzo in the Gospels in various languages, and I found that the word to condemn is translated in the Vulgate and in French by the word condemnare, in Slavonic осуждать, by Luther verdammen, to damn, to doom. The different renderings of these words increased my doubts, and I asked myself what the Greek word krino, used in both the above-mentioned Gospels, could really mean, and what was the true signification of the word katadikadzo, which is used by Luke the evangelist, who wrote, according to the opinion of all able scholars, in good Greek. If a man who knew nothing about the Gospel and the interpretations given to it were to have this saying placed before him, how would he translate it? I consulted the Common Dictionary, and I found that the word krino has many different meanings, and among others is very often used in the sense of condemning by judgment, executing, but never in that of evil speaking. I consulted the glossary of the New Testament, and I found that this word is often used there in the sense of condemning by judgment. It is sometimes used as meaning to choose, but never as to speak evil of. And so I saw that the word krino may be rendered in several ways, but that a translation that renders it as speaking evil of is the furthest from the original. I looked for the word katadikadzo and added to it the word krino, which has several meanings, for the purpose of explaining the sense in which the writer himself takes the first word. I looked in the Common Dictionary for the word katadikadzo, and I found that this word never had any other meaning than to condemn by judgment or to execute. I consulted the glossary of the New Testament, and I found that this word is used in the New Testament 4 times, and every time in the sense of condemn, execute. I consulted the context, and I found that this word is used in the Epistle of James, chapter 5, verse 6, in which it is said, "You have condemned and killed the just." The word condemned is the same word, katadikadzo, which is used in reference to Christ, who was condemned to death. And in no other way and in no other meaning is this word used, either in the whole New Testament or in any Greek dialect. What can this mean? What state of idiocy have I fallen into? All of us, when reflecting on the destiny of man, have been struck with terror at the sufferings and evils that our human criminal laws have brought into our lives, evils both for those who judge and for those who are judged. From the executions of Chinggis Khan in the second half of the 12th century and the revolutions to those of the present day, no man of feeling has escaped the impression of horror and doubt concerning good produced by the recital, if not by the sight, of men executing their fellow men by rods, the guillotine, or the gallows. In the Gospels, every word of which we esteem sacred, it is said clearly and distinctly, "You have the criminal law, a tooth for a tooth, and I give you a new one. Do not resist the evil man. Fulfill this commandment, all of you. Do not return evil for evil. Always do good to all. Forgive all." And farther on we read, "Do not judge." Then, in order to render all doubt impossible as to the meaning of his words, Christ adds, "Do not condemn to punishment by courts of law." My heart says clearly and distinctly, "Do not execute." Science says, "Do not execute. The more you execute, the more evil there will be." Reason says, "Do not execute. You cannot put a stop to evil by evil." The Word of God, which I believe in, says the same. I used to read the whole doctrine. I read these words, "Do not judge, and you shall not be judged. Do not condemn, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you shall be forgiven." I acknowledged that these were God's words, and I thought they meant that we are not to gossip or slander. And I continued to consider courts of law as Christian institutions, and myself as a judge and a Christian. I was shocked at the grossness of the error I was indulging. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of What I Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Believe by Count Leo Tolstoy. Translated from the Russian by Konstantin Popov. Read by David Barnes. Chapter 4. Now I understood what Christ meant when he said, "You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. And I say to you, do not resist evil." Christ means, you have been taught to consider it right and rational to protect yourselves against evil by violence, to pluck out an eye for an eye, to institute courts of law for the punishment of criminals, and to have a police and an army to defend you against the attacks of an enemy. But I say to you, do no violence to any man, take no part in violence, never do evil to any man, not even to those whom you call your enemies. I now understood that in this doctrine of non-resistance, Christ not only tells us what the natural result of following his doctrine will be, but by placing this same doctrine in opposition to the Mosaic law, the Roman law, and the various codes of the present time, he clearly shows us that it ought to be the basis of our social existence, and should deliver us from the evil we have brought on ourselves. He says, "You think to amend evil by your laws, but they only aggravate it. There is one way by which you can put a stop to evil. It is by indiscriminatingly returning good for evil. You have tried the other law for thousands of years, now try mine, which is the very reverse." Strange to say, I have had frequent opportunities lately of conversing with men of diverse opinions on this doctrine of non-resistance. I have met with some who agreed with me, though these have been few. But there are two orders of men who always refuse to admit, even in principle, a direct understanding of this doctrine, and warmly uphold the justice of resisting evil. They are men belonging to two extreme poles: our Christian conservative patriots, who consider their church as the true orthodox one, and our revolutionary atheists. Neither the former nor the latter will give up their right to resist by violence what they consider as evil. Even their cleverest, most learned men close their eyes to the simple, self-evident truth, that if we admit the right of one man to resist what he considers as evil by violence, we cannot refuse another the right to resist by violence what he in his turn may consider as evil. A short time ago I met with a correspondence particularly instructive as bearing on this very point. It was carried on between an Orthodox Slavophile and a Christian revolutionist. The former excused the violence of war in the name of his oppressed Slavonian brethren, and the latter vindicated the violence of the revolution in the name of his oppressed brethren, the Russian peasants. Both admit the necessity for violence, and both ground their reasoning on the doctrine of Christ. Each of us gives the doctrine of Christ an interpretation of his own, but it is never the direct and simple one that flows out of his words. We have grounded the conduct of our lives on a principle that he rejects. We do not choose to understand his teaching in its simple and direct sense. Those who call themselves believers believe that Christ God, the second person of the Trinity, made himself man in order to set us an example how to live, and they strictly fulfill the most complicated duties, such as preparing for the sacraments, building churches, sending out missionaries, naming pastors for parochial administration, etc. They forget only one trifling circumstance: to do as he tells them. Unbelievers, on the other hand, try to regulate their lives somehow or other, but not in accordance with the law of Christ, feeling convinced beforehand that it is worthless. Nobody ever tries to fulfill his teaching. Nor is that all. Instead of making any effort to follow his commandments, both believers and unbelievers decide beforehand that to do so is impossible. Christ says that the law of resistance by violence, which you have made the basis of your lives, is unnatural and wrong, and he gives us instead the law of non-resistance, which, he tells us, can alone deliver us from evil. He says, "You think to eradicate evil by your human laws of violence. They only increase it. During thousands and thousands of years you have tried to annihilate evil by evil, and you have not annihilated it, you have but increased it. Follow the teaching I give you by word and deed, and you will prove its practical power." Not only does he speak thus, but he also remains true to his own doctrine not to resist evil in his life and in his death. Believers take all this in with their ears, and hear it read in churches, calling it the Word of God. They call him God, and then they say, "His doctrine is sublime, but the organization of our lives renders its observance impossible. It would change the whole course of our lives, to which we are so used, and with which we are so satisfied. Therefore, we believe in this doctrine only as an ideal that mankind must strive after, an ideal that is to be attained by prayer, by believing in the sacraments, in redemption, and in the resurrection of the dead." Others, unbelievers, the free interpreters of Christ's doctrine, the historians of religion, Strauss, Renan, and others, adopting the interpretation of the Church that this doctrine has no direct application to life, and is only an ideal teaching that can only serve to console the weak-minded, say, very seriously, that the doctrine of Christ was all very well for the savage population of the deserts of Galilee, but that we, with our civilization, can only consider it as a lovely reverie du charmant docteur, as Renan calls him. According to their opinion, Christ could not attain the height of understanding all the wisdom of our civilization and refinement. If he had stood on the same scale of civilization as these learned men, he would not have uttered those pretty trifles about the birds of the air, about letting one's cheek be struck, and about taking no care for tomorrow. Learned historians judge Christianity according to what they see in our Christian society. Now, the Christian society of our times considers our life as a good and holy one, with its institutions of solitary imprisonment, of fortresses, sweatshops, journals, brothels, and parliaments, while it only borrows from the doctrine of Christ what is not against these habits of life. And, as Christ's teaching is in direct opposition to all this, nothing is taken from that teaching but its mere words. The learned historians see this, and, not having the same interest in concealing the fact as the so-called believers have, they subject this, for them, meaningless doctrine of Christ to a profound analysis, argue against it, and prove on good grounds that Christianity never was anything but the dream of an idealist. And yet it seems to me that before pronouncing an opinion upon the doctrine of Christ, we ought clearly to understand what it is. And in order to decide whether his teaching is rational or not, it is necessary first of all to believe that he meant exactly what he said. This is just what neither the interpreters of the Church nor free thinkers do, and the reason why is not hard to see. We know very well that the teaching of Christ, as we have received it, embraces all the errors into which humanity has fallen, all the toga, empty idols, the existence of which we try to justify by calling them church, government, culture, science, arts, and civilization, thinking thus to exclude them from the rank of errors. But Christ warns us against them all, without excluding any toga. Not only Christ's words, but those of all Hebrew prophets, of John the Baptist, and of all the truly wise men who have ever lived, have referred to this same church, this same government, culture, civilization, etc., calling them evils and the causes of man's perdition. For instance, suppose an architect were to say to the owner of a house, "Your house is in a bad state, it must be wholly rebuilt," and were then to go on giving all the necessary details about the kind of beams that would be required, how they were to be cut and where placed. If the owner were to turn a deaf ear to the architect's words about the ruinous condition of the house and the necessity for its being rebuilt, and were only to listen with a feigned interest to the secondary details concerning the proposed repairs, the architect's counsels would evidently appear but so much useless talk. And if the owner happened to feel no great respect for the builder, he would call his advice foolish. This is exactly what occurs with the teaching of Christ. I use this simile for want of a better one, and I remember that Christ, while preaching his doctrine, used one very like it. He said, "I will destroy your temple, and within 3 days I will build up another." He was crucified for these words. His doctrine is crucified for the same reason, up to the present time. The least that can be required of those who judge another man's teaching is that they should take the teacher's words in the exact sense in which he uses them. Christ does not consider his teaching as some high ideal of what mankind should be but cannot attain to, nor does he consider it as a chimerical, poetical fantasy, fit only to captivate the simple-minded inhabitants of Galilee. He considers his teaching as work, a work that is to save mankind. His suffering on the cross was no dream. He groaned in agony and died for his teaching. And how many people have died and will still die in the same cause? Such teaching cannot be called a dream. Every doctrine of truth is a dream for those who are in error. We have come to such a state of error that there are many among us who say, as I did myself formerly, that this doctrine of Christ is chimerical because it is incompatible with the nature of man. It is incompatible with the nature of man, they say, to turn the other cheek when he has been struck. It is incompatible with the nature of man to give up his property to another, to work not for himself but for others. It is natural to man, they say, to protect himself, his own safety, that of his family and his property. In other words, it is the nature of man to struggle for life. Learned lawyers prove scientifically that the most sacred duty of a man is to protect his rights, that is, to struggle. We need only for one moment to cast aside the idea that the present organization of our lives, as established by man, is the best and most sacred, and then the argument that the teaching of Christ is incompatible with human nature immediately turns against the arguer. Who will deny that it is repugnant and harrowing to a man's feelings to torture or kill not only a man but also even a dog, a hen, or a calf? I have known men living by agricultural labour who have ceased entirely to eat meat only because they had to kill their own cattle. And yet our lives are so organized that for one individual to obtain any advantage in life, another must suffer, which is against human nature. The whole organization of our lives, the complicated mechanism of our institutions, whose sole object is violence, are but proofs of the degree to which violence is repugnant to human nature. No judge will ever undertake to strangle with his own hands the man whom he has condemned to death. No magistrate will himself drag a peasant from his weeping family in order to shut him up in prison. Not a single general, not a single soldier would kill hundreds of Turks or Germans and devastate their villages. No, not one of them would consent to wound a single man, were it not in war, and in obedience to discipline and the oath of allegiance. Cruelty is only exercised, thanks to our complicated social machinery, when it can be so divided among a number that none shall bear the sole responsibility or recognize how unnatural all cruelty is. Some make laws, others apply them. Others again drill their fellow creatures into habits of discipline, that is, of senseless passive obedience. And these same disciplined men in their turn do violence to others, killing without knowing why or wherefore. But let a man even for a moment shake off in thought the net of worldly institutions that so ensnares him, and he will see what is really incompatible with his nature. If once we cease to affirm that the evil we are so used to and profit by is an immutable divine truth, we may see clearly which is the more natural to man, violence or the law of Christ. Which is better, to know that the comfort and safety of my family and myself, all my joys and pleasures, are obtained at the price of the misery, depravity, and suffering of millions, by yearly executions, by hundreds of thousands of suffering prisoners, and by millions of soldiers, policemen, and sergeants, torn from their homes and half stupefied by military discipline, who protect my idle pleasures by keeping starving men at a distance with their loaded pistols. To know that every dainty morsel I put into my mouth or give my children is obtained at the price of all this suffering, which is inevitable in order to obtain those dainties. Or to know that my fare is my own, that nobody suffers for the want of it, and that nobody has suffered in procuring it for me. It is sufficient to comprehend, once and for all, that in our present organization of life, every joy and every moment of peace is bought at the cost of the privations and sufferings of thousands, who are only restrained by violence, in order to see clearly what is natural to man, that is, not only to the animal nature of man, but to the rational nature as well. It is sufficient to understand the doctrine of Christ in all its high significance and with all the consequences it entails, to see that it is not inconsistent with human nature, but that, on the contrary, his whole doctrine throws aside what is inconsistent with human nature, the delusive human teaching of resistance of evil, which is the chief cause of all human misery. The doctrine of Christ, which teaches us not to resist evil, is a dream. But the sight of men in whose breasts love and pity are innate, spending their lives in burning their brethren at the stake, scourging them, breaking them on the wheel, lashing, slitting their nostrils, putting them to the rack, keeping them fettered, sending them to the galleys or the gallows, shooting them, condemning to solitary confinement, imprisoning women and children, organizing the slaughter of tens of thousands by war, bringing about periodical revolutions and rebellions. The sight of others passively fulfilling these atrocities, the sight of others again writhing under these tortures or avenging them, this is no dream. When once we clearly understand the teaching of Christ, we see that it is not the world given by God to man for his happiness that is a dream, but the world such as men have made it for their own destruction that is a wild, terrifying dream, the delirium of a madman, a dream from which it is enough to awake once, never to return to it. God came down from heaven, the Son of God, the second person of the Holy Trinity, and became man to redeem us from the punishment entailed by the sin of Adam. We think that this God must speak in some mysterious, mystical way, difficult to be understood. Indeed, that his word can only be understood through faith and God's grace. And yet, God's words are so simple and so clear. He says, "Do no evil to each other, and there will be no evil." Is it possible that the revelation of God is so simple? Can this be all? All this is so familiar to us. The prophet Elijah, having fled from the haunts of men and concealed himself in a rock, had it revealed to him that he should see God at the entrance of the cavern. A tempest arose, the trees were rent asunder. Elijah thought God was there, and looked, but God was not there. The earth quaked, fire issued out of it, the rock was split in two, and the mountains fell. Elijah looked, but God was not there. Then all grew still and calm, and a light breeze wafted the fragrance of the freshened fields towards him. Elijah looked, and God was there. It is thus with the simple words of God. Do not resist evil. They are very simple, but they contain in themselves the sole and eternal law of God and man. This law is eternal, and if in history we find any progress made towards the annihilation of evil, it is due to those who truly understood the doctrine of Christ, who suffered evil without resisting by violence. The progression of mankind toward good is brought about by martyrdom, not by tyranny. Fire cannot extinguish fire, no more than evil can extirpate evil. Good, meeting with evil and remaining untainted by it, can alone conquer evil. There is a law in the heart of each man that is as immutable as the law of Galileo, still more immutable. Men may turn aside from it or conceal it from others. Nevertheless, it is the only path that leads to true happiness. Each step that has brought us nearer to this great end was taken in the name of the doctrine of Christ. Do not resist evil. It is with greater confidence even than Galileo that the follower of Christ can say, in defiance of all the temptations around him and the threats held out to him, "It is not by violence, but by doing good that you will eradicate evil." And if the progress is made slowly, it is only because the clarity, simplicity, and rationality of the teaching of Christ and its inevitable absolute necessity are concealed from the eyes of men in the most crafty and dangerous manner, concealed under a spurious teaching falsely called his. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of What I Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Believe by Count Leo Tolstoy, translated from the Russian by Konstantin Popov, read by David Barnes. Chapter 5. Everything tended to convince me that I had now found the true interpretation of Christ's doctrine. But it was a long while before I could get used to the strange thought that after so many men had professed the doctrine of Christ during 1800 years, and had devoted their lives to the study of its teachings, it was given to me to discover his doctrine as something altogether new. It seemed strange, nevertheless so it was. Christ's doctrine of non-resistance seemed to rise before me as something hitherto unknown and unfamiliar to me, and I asked myself how this could be. Had some false conception of Christ's doctrine prevented my understanding it? When I first began to read the Gospel, I was not in the position of one who heard the teaching of Christ for the first time. I already had a complete theory concerning the sense in which it was to be taken. Christ did not appear to me as a prophet, come to reveal the law of God to man, but rather as an expounder and amplifier of the indubitable divine law well known to me. I already possessed a complete, definite, and very complicated doctrine concerning God and the creation of the world and of man, as well as concerning the commandments of God as transmitted to us through Moses. In the Gospel I found the words, "You have been told, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist evil." The precept, "an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," was the commandment given by God to Moses. The precept, "I say to you, do not resist evil," was a new commandment that reversed the first. Had I considered the doctrine of Christ simply, without the theological theory I had imbibed from my earliest childhood, I should have understood the true sense of these simple words. I should have seen that Christ sets aside the old law and gives a new one. But it had been instilled into me that Christ did not reject the law of Moses, that, on the contrary, he confirmed it to the least jot and tittle, and amplified it. The 17th and 18th verses of the 5th chapter of St. Matthew, which seem to confirm that assertion, had, in my former studies of the Gospel, struck me by their obscurity, and had raised doubts in my mind. On reading the Old Testament, especially the last books of Moses, in which so many trivial, useless, and even cruel laws are laid down, each preceded by the words, "And God said to Moses," it seemed passing strange to me that Christ should have confirmed such laws. His doing so seemed incomprehensible. But I then left the problem unsolved. I blindly believed the teaching of my childhood, that these commandments were inspired by the Holy Ghost, that they were in perfect harmony with each other, that Christ confirmed the law of Moses, and that he amplified and completed it. I could, indeed, never clearly explain to myself wherein the amplification lay, nor how the striking opposition, so obvious to all, between the verses 17 to 20 and the words, "But I say to you," could be harmonized. But when I at last really understood the clear and simple meaning of Christ's doctrine, I saw that these two commandments were in direct opposition to each other, that there could be no question of harmony between them, or of the one being an amplification of the other, that it was necessary to accept either the one or the other, and that the interpretation of verses 17 to 20 of the 5th chapter of St. Matthew, which, as I have already said, had struck me by their want of clarity, was erroneous. On a second reading of the same verses 17 to 20, which had seemed so unintelligible to me, their meaning flashed full upon me. This again was not the result of my having discovered anything new, or having made any alteration of the words. It was due solely to my having cast aside the false interpretation that had been given to them. Christ says, in Matthew 5:17 to 19, "Do not think that I have come to destroy the law or the teaching of the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle, the least particle, shall in no way pass from the law until all is fulfilled." And in verse 20 he adds, "Except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven." Christ means by these words, "I have not come to destroy the eternal law, for the fulfillment of which your books and prophecies are written, but I have come to teach you how to fulfill that eternal law. I do not speak of the law that your teachers, the Pharisees, call the law of God, but of the eternal law, which is less liable to change than heaven and earth. I here give the meaning of the text in other words, solely for the purpose of drawing the mind away from the incorrect interpretation usually offered. If this incorrect interpretation did not exist, we should see that the idea of Christ could not be better or more definitely expressed than by these words. The interpretation that Christ does not reject the Mosaic law is based on the fact that in this passage, without any ostensible reason, except the comparison of the jot of the written law, and contrary to the true sense, the word law is treated as meaning the written law, and not the eternal law. But Christ does not speak here of the written law. If Christ in this passage had spoken of the written law, he would have used the words, the law and the prophets, as he always does in speaking of the written law. But he uses a very different expression, the law or the prophets. Had Christ meant to speak of the written law, he would have used the words the law and the prophets in the next verse, which is but the continuation of the preceding one, but there he uses the word law alone. Moreover, we find in the Gospel according to St. Luke that Christ uses the same words in a manner that leaves no doubt as to their true meaning. Luke 16, verse 15. Christ says to the Pharisees, who thought to justify themselves by the written law, "You are those who justify themselves before men, but God knows your hearts, for that which is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presses into it." And immediately after this, in the 17th verse, we read, "And it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail." The words, "the law and the prophets until John," annul the written law. The words, "it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than for one tittle of the law to fail," confirm the eternal law. In the first text, Christ says, "the law and the prophets," i.e. the written law. In the second, he uses the word law alone, that is, the eternal law. It is obvious, therefore, that the eternal law is here set in opposition to the written law, and that exactly the same occurs in the context of the Gospel of St. Matthew, where the eternal law is expressed by the words, the law or the prophets. The history of the different renderings of this text, verses 17 to 18, is very curious. In most of the transcripts, the word law is not followed by the words and the prophets. In this case, there can be no doubt of its signifying the eternal law. In other transcripts, as for instance in those of Tischendorf and the canonical transcripts, the word prophets is added, not with the conjunction and, but with the disjunctive or, the law or the prophets, which likewise excludes the meaning of the written law and confirms that of the eternal law. In some transcripts again, which are not adopted by the Church, we find the word prophets preceded by the conjunction and not by or. In these transcripts, after the repetition of the word law, the words and the prophets are again added. Thus the meaning given to the whole saying by this remodeling is that Christ's words refer only to the written law. These variations give us the history of the various interpretations to which this passage has been subjected. One point is obvious. Christ speaks here, as he does in the Gospel according to St. Luke, of the eternal law. But we find men among the transcribers of the Gospels who have added the words and the prophets to the word law, with the design of rendering the Mosaic law obligatory, and have thus altered the sense of the text. Other Christians, again, who reject the Mosaic law, either leave out the word completely, or substitute the word or for the word kai, and thus the passage enters the canon with the disjunctive or. Yet though the text adopted by the canon is so indubitably clear, our canonical commentators continue to expound on the passage in the spirit of the alterations that have not been adopted. Countless commentators have treated this passage, and as the expounder agrees less with the simple, direct sense of the doctrine of Christ, the further his commentary must necessarily be from the true sense of that doctrine. The majority of expounders retain the apocryphal sense, which the text rejects. In order to be convinced that Christ speaks in this verse only of the eternal law, it will suffice to fully understand the word that has given rise to these false interpretations. In Russian, it is zakon, law; in Greek, nomos; in Hebrew, Torah. This word has two principal meanings in the Russian, Greek, and Hebrew languages. The one, the unexpressed, unwritten law; the other, the written expression of what certain men call the law. Indeed, the difference exists in all languages. In Greek, in the epistles of Paul, the difference is sometimes marked by the use of the article. In speaking of the written law, the apostle omits the article before the word law, and when he speaks of the eternal law, the article is prefixed. The ancient Hebrews, the prophets, and Isaiah always use the word Torah, the law, to indicate the eternal, unwritten but revealed law of God. This same word, Torah, the law, was first used by Ezra, and later we find it in the Talmud, as signifying the 5 books of Moses, which bear the general title of Torah, in the same sense as our word Bible, with this difference, however, that we distinguish the Bible from the law of God by 2 different denominations, while in the Hebrew language there is but one word for both. Therefore Christ, using the word Torah, takes it in the 2 different accepted meanings of the word, either confirming it, as Isaiah and the other prophets do, in the sense of the law of God which is eternal, or rejecting it, when he refers to the Mosaic law. But in order to make a distinction between the different meanings of the word, he always adds, and the prophets, and the pronoun your, in speaking of the written law. When Christ says, "As you would want men to treat you, also treat them likewise. This is the whole law and the prophets," he refers to the written law. He tells us that the whole written law may be reduced to this sole expression of the eternal law. And by these his words he annuls the written law. When he says, in Luke 16, verse 16, "the law and the prophets until John the Baptist," he refers to the written law, and by these words asserts that it is no longer obligatory. When he says, in John 7:19, "Didn't Moses give you the law? And yet none of you keeps the law." Or John 8:17, "Isn't it said in your law?" Or again John 15:25, "The word that is written in their law." He refers to the written law, the law that he rejects, the law by which he was soon after sentenced to death. John 19, verse 7, "The Jews answered him, 'We have a law, and by our law he ought to die.'" It is obvious that this law of the Hebrews, by which Christ himself was sentenced to death, was not the law that he taught. But when Christ says, "I come not to destroy the law, but to teach you to fulfill it, for nothing can be altered in the law, but all must be fulfilled," he does not speak of the written law, but of the divine, eternal law. It may be said that these proofs are controvertible, that I have skillfully assorted the contexts, and have carefully concealed all that could contradict my interpretation, that the commentaries given by the Church are very clear and convincing, and that Christ did not destroy the law of Moses, but that he left it in full force. Let us suppose that this be the case. What, then, does Christ teach? According to the commentaries of the Church, he taught men that he was the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God the Father, and that he had come down from heaven to redeem mankind from the sin of Adam. But whoever has read the Gospel knows that Christ says nothing of this, or at least alludes to it in very ambiguous terms. The passages in which Christ speaks of himself as being the second person of the Trinity, and of his redeeming mankind, are the shortest and least perspicuous in the Gospels. In what, then, does the rest of Christ's teaching consist? It is impossible to deny what all Christians have always acknowledged, that the main point in Christ's doctrine consists in his rules of life, how men are to live together. Now, if we admit that Christ taught a new system of life, we must form some definite idea of the men among whom he taught. Take, for instance, the Russians, the English, the Chinese, the Hindus, or even any wild insular tribe, and you will be sure to find that they all have their own rules of life, their own laws, and that no teacher could introduce new laws of life without destroying the former ones. He could not teach without infringing them. Such would be the case everywhere. The teacher would inevitably have to begin by destroying our laws, which have grown precious and almost sacred in our eyes. Perhaps in our days it might happen that the teacher of a new doctrine of life would only destroy our civil laws, our government, and our customs, without interfering with the laws that we call divine, though this is hardly probable. But the Hebrews had only one law, a divine law that embraced life in its minutest details. What could a preacher teach them if he began by declaring that the entire law of the people to whom he preached was inviolable? But let us assume that this is not regarded as a proof. Then let those who assert that Christ's words confirmed the Mosaic law explain to themselves who they were whom Christ denounced during his whole life. Who did he speak against, calling them Pharisees, lawyers, and scribes? Who was it that refused to follow the doctrine of Christ and crucified him? If Christ acknowledged the Mosaic law, where were the true followers of the law whom Christ must have approved of? Is there a single one? We are told that the Pharisees were a sect. The Hebrews do not say so. They call the Pharisees the true fulfillers of the law. But let us suppose they were a sect. The Sadducees were also a sect. Where then were the true believers, those who did not belong to any sect? In the Gospel according to St. John, all the enemies of Christ are called Hebrews. They do not assent to Christ's doctrine. They oppose it only because they are Hebrews. But in the Gospel, the Pharisees and Sadducees are not the only enemies of Christ. The lawgivers who keep the Mosaic law, the scribes who study it, and the elders who are considered as the representatives of the popular wisdom are likewise called the enemies of Christ. Christ says, "I did not come to call the righteous to repentance," to a change of life, metanoia, but sinners. Where were the righteous, and who were they? Surely Nicodemus was not the only one, and even Nicodemus is described as being a good man, but one who had gone astray. We have grown so used to the singular interpretation given to us, that the Pharisees and some wicked Hebrews crucified Christ, that the simple question never occurs to us, where were the true Hebrews who kept the law, and who were neither Pharisees nor wicked men? No sooner does the question arise than all grows clear. Christ, be he God or man, brought his doctrine to a people who already had a law that gave them definite rules of life, and which they called the law of God. In what light could Christ have considered that law? Every prophet, teacher of a faith, on revealing the law of God to a people, will find that they already possess a law that they consider as the divine law, and he cannot avoid a twofold application of the word, as referring either to what men wrongly consider the law of God, your law, or as referring to the true eternal law of God. Moreover, not only is the preacher of the new doctrine unable to avoid the twofold use of the word, but it often happens that he does not even endeavour to do so, and purposely unites both ideas, in order to point out that the law confessed by those he tries to convert, though defective as a whole, is not devoid of some divine truths. And it is just these truths, so familiar to his hearers, which every preacher will take as the basis of his preaching. Christ does so in addressing the Hebrews, who have the same word, Torah, for both laws, referring to the Mosaic law, and more often still to the prophets, especially the prophet Isaiah, whom he often quotes. Christ acknowledges that in the Hebrew law and in the prophets there are eternal truths, divine truths, which coincide with the eternal law, and he bases his doctrine upon them, as for instance in the saying, "Love God and your neighbour." Christ expresses this idea on many occasions, for example, Luke 10 verse 26. What is written in the law? How do you read it? We may find the eternal truth in the law, if we can read. And he points out more than once that the precept contained in their law of love to God and their neighbour was a precept of the eternal law. After the parables by which he explains his doctrine to his disciples, Christ says, as if in reference to all that had preceded, "Therefore every scribe," that is, every man who can read and has been taught the truth, "is like a householder who brings forth out of his treasure indiscriminately things old and new." Matthew 13 verse 52. It is thus that St. Irenaeus understands these words, and so does the Church, and yet, arbitrarily transgressing the true sense of the saying, they attribute to these words the meaning that the whole ancient law is sacred. The obvious meaning of the text is that he who seeks for what is good takes not only what is new, but what is old too, and that its being old is not a sufficient reason for throwing it aside. Christ means by this saying that he does not deny what is eternal in the ancient law, but when questioned concerning the law or its forms, he says, "We do not pour new wine into old bottles." Christ could not confirm the whole law, neither could he completely deny the law and the prophets. He could neither deny the law that says, "Love your neighbour as yourself," nor the prophets, in whose word he often clothes his thought. And so, instead of our understanding these clear and simple words as they were said, and in the sense that the whole doctrine of Christ confirms, an obscure interpretation is given to us, which introduces inconsistency where there is none, and thus destroys the true sense of the doctrine, leaving nothing but words, and in reality re-establishing the Mosaic teaching with all its barbarous cruelty. According to the commentaries of the Church, and those of the 5th century in particular, Christ did not destroy the written law, but confirmed it. But we are not told how he confirmed it, or how the law of Christ and the Mosaic law can be supposed to be united into one. We find nothing in these commentaries but a play upon words. We are told that Christ kept the Mosaic law by the prophecies concerning himself being fulfilled, and that Christ fulfilled the law through us, through the faith of men in him. No effort is made to solve the only question that is of essential importance to every believer: how these two contradictory laws, referring to life, can be united into one. The inconsistency of the text, which says that Christ does not destroy the law, with the one in which we read, "It has been said, but I say to you," indeed the contradiction between the whole spirit of the Mosaic law and the doctrine of Christ, remains in all its force. Let everyone who is interested in this question examine for himself the commentaries on this passage given to us by the Church, beginning from John Chrysostom to the present time. It is only after having read these that he will see clearly, not only that no explanation of the contradiction is given, but also that a contradiction has been skillfully inserted where there was none before. The impossible attempts at uniting what cannot be united are clear proof that this was not an involuntary mental error, but was effected with some definite purpose in view, that it was found necessary, and the cause of its having been found necessary is obvious. Let us see what John Chrysostom says in answer to those who reject the Mosaic law. Commentary of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, Volume 1, pages 320 and 321. Quote, "On examining the ancient law that enjoins us to take an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth, the objection is raised, how can he who speaks thus be righteous? What answer can we give? Why, that it is, on the contrary, the best token of God's love towards man. It was not that we should really take an eye for an eye that he gave us this law, but that we should avoid wronging others, for fear of suffering the same at their hands. As, for instance, when threatening the Ninevites with destruction, his desire was not to destroy them. Had he indeed decreed their destruction, he would not have spoken of it. His purpose was only, by his menaces, to induce them to amend their lives, and by so doing turn his wrath aside. Thus likewise the hot-tempered, who are ready to put out their neighbours' eyes, are threatened with punishment for the sole purpose of making their fears of punishment restrain them from injuring their fellow creatures. If this is cruelty, there is cruelty likewise in the commandment that forbids murder, or the one that interdicts adultery. But such an argument would only prove a man to have reached the last stage of madness, and I so dread calling these commandments cruel, that I should rather be inclined to consider a contrary law as wrong, according to plain common sense. You call God cruel because he has enjoined taking an eye for an eye, but I say that many would have had a greater right to call him cruel, as you do, had he not given this commandment." Unquote. John Chrysostom plainly acknowledges the law of a tooth for a tooth to be the divine law, and the reverse of that law, i.e. Christ's doctrine of non-resistance, to be wrong. On pages 322 to 323, John Chrysostom further says, quote, "Let us suppose that the law is entirely cast aside, that all fear of promised punishment is done away with, that the wicked are left to live according to their inclinations without fear of punishment, adulterers, murderers, thieves and perjurers. Wouldn't all be overthrown? Wouldn't houses, marketplaces, cities, lands, seas, and the whole universe be full of iniquity? This is obvious. But if even the existence of laws, fear, and threats of punishment can hardly keep the evil-intentioned with bounds, what would there then be to restrain men from evil deeds, if all obstacles were removed? What disasters would then rush in torrents into the lives of men? Cruelty does not lie in leaving the wicked free to act as they please, but in letting the innocent man suffer without defending him. If a man were to collect a crowd of miscreants around him, and having furnished them with weapons, were to send them forth into the town to kill all those they met in the streets, could anything be more barbarous? And if another were to bind these armed men and imprison them, releasing the victims these miscreants had threatened with death, could anything be more humane?" Unquote. But John Chrysostom does not tell us by what means the other is to be guided in his definition of the wicked. May he not himself be a wicked man and imprison the good? Quote, "Now apply this example to the law. He who gave the commandment, an eye for an eye, has bound the minds of the wicked in chains of fear, and may be compared to the man who bound the miscreants. But if no punishment were appointed for criminals, would it not be arming them with weapons of fearlessness, and acting like him who gave weapons to the miscreants, and sent them forth into the town?" Unquote. If John Chrysostom does acknowledge the doctrine of Christ, he ought to have told us who is to take an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth, and cast into prison. If he who gave the commandment, that is, God himself, were to inflict the threatened punishment, there would be no inconsistency. But it must be done by men, the men who are forbidden to do so by the Son of God. God said, "An eye for an eye." The Son says, "Do not act thus." One of the commandments must be acknowledged as just. John Chrysostom and the Church follow the commandments of the Father, that is, the Mosaic law, and reject the commandments of the Son, while ostensibly professing his doctrine. Christ rejects the Mosaic law and gives his own in its stead. For him who believes in Christ there is no contradiction. He pays no heed to the Mosaic law, believes in Christ's doctrine and fulfills it. Neither is there any contradiction for him who believes in the Mosaic law. The Hebrews do not consider the words of Christ valid, and they believe in the Mosaic law. There is a contradiction only for those who, while choosing to live according to the Mosaic law, try to persuade themselves and others that they believe in the doctrine of the Christ. Only for those whom Christ calls, "You hypocrites, you generation of vipers." Instead of acknowledging one of the two, either the Mosaic law or the doctrine of Christ, we say that both are divine truths. But no sooner does the question touch upon life itself than the doctrine of Christ is straightway cast aside, and the Mosaic law is acknowledged. If we examine this false interpretation closely, we shall see in it one phase of the awful struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. Christ appears among the Hebrews, who were entangled in countless minute rules, laid down by their Levites and called by them the divine law, each of which was preceded by the words, "And God said to Moses." Not only the relations in which man stands to God, but the sacrifices, feast days, fasts, the relations between men, public, civil, and family relations, all the details of private life, circumcision, ablution of themselves and their cups, their clothes, all, even in the most trifling details, were encompassed by rules, and these were acknowledged as the commandments of God, the law of God. What could a prophet do? I do not say Christ God, but what could a prophet, a teacher, do when teaching such a people, without first destroying the obligations of a law by which everything, down to the smallest detail of life, was thus regulated? Christ does what any other prophet would do. He takes from the old law, considered by the people as divine, what is truly the law of God. He takes the basic principles, setting all the rest aside, and he adds to it his own revelation of the eternal law. Though all need not be cast aside, a law that is considered obligatory in all its minutest details must inevitably be violated. This is what Christ does, and he is accused of destroying the law of God, and he is crucified for this. But his teaching remains among his disciples and passes on to other peoples. Yet, in the course of ages and among the new peoples who receive Christ's truth, the same human interpretations and explanations shoot up. Again, the shallow precepts of man appear in place of the divine revelation. Instead of the words, "And God said to Moses," we now read, "by the revelation of the Holy Spirit." Again, the letter rather than the spirit of the doctrine is preferred. It is a striking fact that the doctrine of Christ is united to all this Torah, which he rejected. This Torah is said to be the revelation of the Spirit of truth, that is, of the Holy Ghost, and so Christ is taken in the meshes of his own revelation. And now, after 1800 years, the strange duty has fallen to my lot to discover the sense of Christ's doctrine as something new. It is no small discovery that I had to make. I had to do what all those who seek to know God and his law have to do, to find out the eternal law of God from amidst the precepts that men call his law. End of chapter 5.